can start.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So, welcome everyone and greetings to all wherever you are. I hope there is some safety and health. My name is Prasad Shetty and I work with the School of Environment and Architecture here in Mumbai. It's 5:30 in the evening here. Hopefully the second wave of the pandemic the peak of the second wave of the pandemic has passed over here. There is some calmness now, and we've had seasonal storms adding to the overall intensities of the time, but otherwise it's more or less calm here. The lockdown was announced last year on 17th March 2020 in Mumbai. And I remember the evening before when the Chief Minister made the announcement. This was the first lockdown and one had to experience. And nobody was sure what it really meant. The next day, the digital was reborn as the outside. At first, bringing some stories, but later as time passed, it became the home and the outside where lives would be lived. Many things started happening after that fairly quickly. None of them usual, and which the city had seen before. The lockdown had meant shortage in provisions, stoppages in work, bringing an environment of black marketing and financial crisis amongst many families and organizations. Then the illnesses started getting reported, the deaths escalated, the health system cracked, other systems of education, governance, and even religion, which held, the society, started cracking. There was nobody in the state, no financial advisors or health experts or city managers who would tell us what needs to be done next. At that moment, the centralizing structure of society had started cracking, and smaller compassions, friendships, constellations, solidarities, mutualities were the ones that held us together. At sea, we use the field to look at ourselves and ask questions about ourselves instead of the field. When we go to the field, we don't necessarily ask questions about the field. We ask questions about ourselves via the field. We try not to get surprised by the field, but by our own lives. What did this pandemic tell us about our society as it is today? How do we make sense of this madness? And why is it necessary to make sense at all? Probably because we saw the system that held us together was crumbling. The difficulty really is the distance of time and space. That distance, which is so important to make sense. You have the distance, and then it is possible to make sense because you see many things from a distance and see them together. Being trapped within the house and living through the pandemic, our visceral experiences was only about ourselves. Maybe our houses, our streets, and probably our neighborhoods. Nothing. All other experiences were mediated. With this background, we at C decided to share our stories with each other. We set up an online document where people from C wrote, some about their personal lives, some viewing the times. They recorded experiences, practices, and their negotiations with the pandemic. This became the COVID Glossary. And we hope that if many such stories came together, they would produce narratives that would make sense of what is going on and probably give clues about ourselves. The glossary has been growing since then. It has been populated by the people of C. Probably it holds in its background, or probably it holds in it the backgrounds and biases of the people of C. But nevertheless, it is able to generate some patterns in our minds. When these stories came together, they started creating narratives about the pandemic. But these narratives themselves started exploding when other stories got added and nuanced them. We bring today some of these narratives and patterns that we've been able to put together. Before I start with a walkthrough of the glossary and the exhibition, I would like to thank the contributors of the project, the students, teachers, administrative staff, and many more people associated with C who have added a small slice of their experience to this glossary. There are more than 400 entries at the moment, and it will keep on growing till the pandemic fades away. I would like to thank especially our collaborators and partners and supporters, Madhushri Datta, Clara Nab, Adrian Namabaja from the Academy of the Arts of the World from Cologne. Madhushri is already here. It was actually Madhushri's initiation, the Times of Hands, which provided the provocation. Brian Kittles and Amrita Nimavant are also here from the Goethe Institute, Maxwell Bhavan in India. I would like to thank the Goethe Institute for helping us with their support for this project. And lastly, at this moment, I would like to thank the central core of the project, Vastavikta Bhagat, who despite all her difficulties gave shape to this project as it stands today. Moomal Shekhawat joined 3 months ago with new energy and steered the project in a new direction. The glossary and the exhibition is completely designed and put together by these two designers of C. They were able to give shape to the idea of generating multiple narratives from micro stories. Now that's the form of the glossary at the moment. The exhibition at the moment is such that no two persons can view it in the same manner, and they will seldom see the same thing again. The form of the exhibition is able to hold the complexity of the multiple narratives. Vastavikta Bhagat and Moomal Shekhawat are both part of the School of Environment and Architecture. Vastavikta is an architect, artist, and teaches at C. Moomal is a designer and works as a researcher here. Both of them shall be presenting some of the patterns that can be drawn out of the glossary. I will now invite Vastu, as we call Vastavikta, Vastu, and Moomal to take us through the glossary and the exhibition. Vastu.
Just a second. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Good evening and thank you, Prasad. It has been an unreal experience to work on the glossary. Rupali very recently in her talk mentioned that the glossary has the power to put together narratives. It also holds the capacity to break and restructure them into new ones. I believe this is what we should hold on to while navigating through the glossary and the exhibition of patterns. The core glossary can largely be viewed by through our web address, which is coreglossary.net. The expanded glossary can be entered through from here on the menu bar. From March 2020, we started collecting stories and experiences of the pandemic within the school. Around 200 people and their friends started contributing to the glossary. These entries range from the experiences of contracting the virus to be locked in, of escapes and hacks, of vulnerabilities and fragilities, of slippages and collapses, of records and accounts of new practices and routines. Each entry became a pixel in the glossary, and one could traverse through this landscape of pixels that came together to coagulate and restructure narratives. For instance, let me go through some of these pixels to kind of show you the diversity of the glossary. One such entry is, say, the idea of the guest. The idea of the guest shaped the home, where the home became a visual object, an image of the family. The image was a projection of the family's collectively negotiated idea of presentable to the society, which therefore reflected their idea of the society. Another pixel, its Groundhog Day starts talking about the everyday. My brother came back from Australia last night, and since then our house has been filled to capacity. 4 humans and 2 dogs, and the uncountable invisible forces that got locked in within the walls of our apartment. It was the 22nd of March, and for the next 200 days, it would still be the 22nd of March. My eyes open, windows shut, laptops open, room doors open, fridge doors shut, laptop shut, eyes shut, and it happens again. I felt like I was sitting in the carriage with Emily Dickinson, Death and Immortality, with all of us headed to eternity. Luckily, Bill Murray held my hand and pulled me back, shook me up, and woke me up from my trance, right after he revisited the movie with me. If you're going to live the same day 200 times, it can be lived in 200 different ways. Our everyday start taking over. Our politics starts coming into focus. In every new way, we choose to live the same day over. Different understandings of ourselves get unveiled. In both, uh, in both stories, one where Bill Murray is the protagonist and the other where it is me, we are building our understanding of ourselves through the everydayness of 2nd February and 22nd March, respectively. Another pixel talks about certain instances that have occurred in the domestic space. My father and a network of Swayam Sevaks are circulating Vanushadhis, which are herbal products from the jungle, with their center as Keshav Shrishti in Bhayandar, which is another suburb in Mumbai. I visited a friend of my dad recently who is a local bag shop owner. He sews and sells his own bags and also repairs bags, chains, suitcases, etc. He took an order from my father through WhatsApp and bought aloe vera gel, kadhas, chawanprash, and other herbal Ayurvedic products from us. He especially travels for these orders from Santa Cruz to Bhayandar to get these products for the ones who ordered them. When I was having a conversation with him, his phone rang, and the ringtone was Namaste Sada Vatsalya Matribhumi, the prayer anthem of the RSS. I have known him since my childhood. He had regularly taken his sons to the Shakha every morning. And whenever he used to come home, he used to try to convince my brother and me too. My father just set him as an example for us, but never asked to come with him. I have attended a few events like the birthday of Dr. Hedgevar since we had the photos of him and Govaikar with Bharat Mata, which they needed to be tie garlands over. Some pixels also talk about the new forms of enterprises and entrepreneurships that have emerged in this time, where one such entry talks about Ashish is a middle class interior designer come turnkey contractor for interior design projects in the lockdown. He lost his business. He started making ends meet by bootlegging cigarettes and selling to his friends for a small commission. Sanjana was a contemporary dancer. In the lockdown, she started making ends meet by baking cakes and pastries and delivering them. The areas, uh, so with these new enterprises and these new routines, there were also new changes in the spatiality of the home and the neighborhood and everything. And for example, the entry on portals talks about the balcony becomes a portal for the transaction of goods. Because of the rule that condemns delivery people and non-residents from entering a society, the balcony has turned out to serve in this purpose. The space provides a new possibility for transactions, especially for people on the higher floors or the elderly. In a new way of transaction, it is a new way of transactions that are contactless. People use ropes, chains, even electrical cables to serve as police for the transaction. Another kind of entry, and this is the last one that I'll go through, talks about shop houses that are emerging in the other market. The areas around the major markets in Dadar have experienced a new rental demand by men who, since the shutdown of the railway, have rented beds in small charlies around the area where they could come and sleep and keep their shops open for small opportunities that they might have to sell. So the glossary is filled with these multiple instances, and we believe that it will keep on growing. And this is us opening it up to everyone to come and contribute to the glossary, which can be done through the contribute section in our page, which is over here. So we invite everyone to still to contribute to the glossary. Moreover, another important aspect of the glossary is that we've tried to maintain the voice of the contributor, as it is important to understand how one sees and makes sense of the pandemic and where one is located. Adding to this, over the last 2 months, we've started drawing patterns from our glossary to try to understand the pandemic. We've put them together in an online exhibition, which can be entered from here, from the main website, or one can also access the exhibition from covidglossary.online. And like Prasad said, that it has the possibility of every individual having a different kind of experience. Over here, even the interface is constantly morphing, and it keeps on expanding as and when entries and patterns start getting drawn. And we hope to draw more patterns with our respondents here. Um, one can just 1 second. Yeah. So after kind of entering the interface, what you see is a series of narrative spheres, and what one has to do is just basically click on. One can pan, zoom, rotate, and just click on any of these spheres, and you're taken inside a pattern. And And what it would ask you is you can click here to start the media basically, and a lot of them have videos and something interactive going on in the backdrop. And the way these boards are made is these narrative spheres are designed is that each reading is self-guided, so one can go through it, scroll through it, and make multiple readings of a particular pattern. I'll just stop sharing my screen for a bit. So Mumble and me will go through some of these patterns from the narrative spheres. So since a year, all of us have largely been locked in. We faced different forms of vulnerabilities: financial, social, and health. Each individual was impacted by the pandemic. The experience of these vulnerabilities was largely contained inside the spatiality of the house. And here, something that none of us anticipated was the fact that one would have to be confined within these four walls of what we conventionally call a house: a Bombay flat for some and a Kholi for another. I say confinement here because the context where I come from, the idea of the home and the house may not be one and the same. In this regard, contradictorily, I speak that the home has rather been that fuzzy in between, a locus of social and personal experiences where belongingness, identities, and power relations are intersectionally connected. Uh, from a population that lives with extreme densities and complexities, for a lot of my friends, as the glossary suggests, home would happen in public spaces beyond the house, in our hostels, in the corridors of an institution, or in a busy market. With the announcement of the curfew, we were hoping that the physical barriers of the house could create a safety bubble from this unknown virus that was spreading like wildfire. And begrudgingly, there was a forceful collapse of the house and the home within these four walls. The home was forced to shrink within the house. And it was within this partiality where instances of violence occurred. It became the container of our fears, phobias, anxieties, and there was a psychological exertion of being trapped in the same spot, in the same space, unable to make sense of the outside. It became an ambivalent place where we unknowingly bid our last goodbyes to our loved ones, unsure of their return after recovering from the virus. The collapse had its own complexities. One such narrative from the glossary, which reflects on this experience of the domestic and the power relations and inhabitation of the home that emerged within the collapse, reads: the idea of the power within the domestic space became more apparent since the lockdown into a space which cannot be escaped. This need to escape forces the inhabitants to negotiate spaces as both domestic and work have been brought together. One can ask oneself about the spaces women used to inhabit when the men weren't home, and in the absence of children during school hours in a joint family. In my house, the women of the house used to come together during most of the day and would separate when both the men were home. But during the lockdown, the two rooms in the two-bedroom hall kitchen apartment work as separate households in one house, while the women meet only in the kitchen. The boundaries to soften amongst the women in the house, but the claim to a particular space place has become stronger. And claim has been an emerging concept within the glossary, spoken about in softer ways, where one says, members of the house have formed their bubbles in which they reside and ask the other to leave if they are in their place. These cells are complete in their own way with certain kinds of supplies. The idea of the backpack opens itself up. What you carry with you is something you wouldn't interact with the other to get. Therefore, there is a certain kind of disappearance that we experience every day. There is not only claiming, but also an act of cellularization and fragmenting in the spatiality of the house. And in the process of cellularizing and claiming, people were looking to disappear, to escape beyond the physical and digital, where there was a constant gaze of the other, and every move was getting surveilled. Where another entry reflects on this. There was an increased interaction with family and increased engagement in the home and into each other's affairs. It meant that escape from each other in a physical and mental capacity became impossible. And therefore, there was a reinforcement of the relationships we shared. And the conflicts which had earlier become, and the conflicts which had earlier become faded in the background. The escapes were then sought in the form of online connections, new nooks of the building were explored as hiding spots. What also happened was the notion of work from home began trickling in, creating its own unique spatialities, which led to the expanding of functionality within the previously spoken about cellularized space. While one entry begins to expand, the house is daunting. House is an airy body, bloody, bumpy, boxy, bulky, busy, chilly, chunky, cozy, cringy, funny, fuzzy, grumpy, gooey, happy, hairy, and so it goes on, fully capable of keeping us engaged, arrested. House is an ontological sandpit. Here, in this arrested space, um, spaces around windows, plug points, single tables and corners were seen as ideal places of inhabitation and claim to form one's own private work environment in the domestic constructs of the home. From the glossary, we were able to draw on terminologies like the safety door, the back entrance, the second home, that became the threshold where extreme processes of sanitization were conducted to keep the unwanted outside out. There was a hijack of a single object, which was the sanitizer. They became portals through which any contact of transaction was carried out within the world rather carefully with deep anxiety. Whereas the terrace and the balcony gained political significance. They afforded by a certain class became places of contemplation as well as public spectacle. The slip through in between spaces was sought out. While these escapes and releases were sought about, the spatiality of these confined houses was also restrictive or changing to allow for these acts of claim, cellularizing and escaping. Another entry further contemplates on the gendered and social construct of these collapsed spatiality while seeking darkness or seeking to disappear through excerpts. So I'll be reading a few of the excerpts from the entry after we play this video.
Do you think we'll make it? Do you think we'll be able to turn Bombay again into a place we can live in and work in and enjoy being in? I often think of this city, what it was, what it is. And what it could become again.
While the mind wanders within a virtual medium, its inability to engross us into a space, given the oculocentric nature of our devices, frustrates us. The disciplinary image of being or the identity of a son is what produces the experience of power, and hence disallows from being a student, a lover, or a smoker. While the apartment does not afford these darknesses, it does not afford an excuse to escape as well, since it isolates one from its neighborhood and the long distance engagements are now online. On the other hand, the city of Mumbai does not afford these darknesses as well. And its inability to do so was much more apparent during this pandemic. Since the local trains are not functioning throughout the lockdown, the physical distance to escape the house and neighborhood became expensive. A friend and I started meeting on her building terrace to smoke, but soon the watchman got suspicious and started taking rounds. So we met less often and were paranoid whenever we did meet. Once that was unreliable, we asked around looking for other terraces. But most buildings, including mine, have their terraces locked, opened only when permission is granted from a committee member. The lack of safer spots has made the enjoyment of transgressions fearful and hasty. Time is wasted if the time to transgress is used to do anything else. It ends with a question which I would also like us to further dwell on. What is the place that affords the process of making home? The lockdown opened up these difficult questions around this collapse of the home and the house, which the glossary puts together and dismantles at the same time. Another narrative sphere which I would like to open up is one on the new entrepreneurship that was emerging. Uh, while while we were facing all these collapses, there was another larger shift driven by the pandemic and the digital realm. New forms of work that were hybrid, non-site specific, and skill-based emerged. Let me read out a collection of practices, tricks, and businesses that were recorded over time. A person says, I have a friend who's a pharmacist. So she was telling me that remdesivir hai, it comes through distributors. So I have another friend. He has contacts with the distributor. और वो इसके पास से ही वो ऐसे निकाल के देता है. So another person responds, trickle होकर आता है. What I'm trying to say is that you realize that excessive centralization kind of crashes things, because then it brings it down for everyone. और फिर उसमें क्या होता है कि then you are left to fend for yourselves, and then you don't know what to do. I'm really struggling to get a set of injections, and my mobilization was kind of 100%. But it was, I don't know if people are able to do that. But it's through these strange networks that this happens. Another entry of bootlegging and black marketeering talks about Nitin, who bootlegged cigarettes and alcohol in Andheri. His phone number was shared amongst a wide network of people who were looking for cigarettes. People in need of cigarettes would approach others smoking to ask them where they got their cigarettes from. They could also share Nitin's number, whose landmark for meeting people was in front of a COVID facility, as it was the most prominent building in an otherwise labyrinthine urban village setting that Nitin operated in. There was also a pause in the financial incomes of individuals, which led many people to start with new temporary businesses or trades. Similar things happened in this family. Sources of wholesalers selling sodium hypochlorite sanitizers, masks, gloves, and other sanitizing equipments were found and contacted. These products were resold from the home. Information about the new business was passed on through WhatsApp messages. Continuous streams of messages and phone calls kept us all busy and prevented us from getting bored. Everybody in the house was mobilized to find contacts, to buy and sell the products. Eventually, a network was developed of buyers and sellers with their own financial margins. This eventually led to new telephonic, non-permanent friendships. My house at the time was fully occupied with cans and sanitizers and packets of gloves, masks, and face shields. This new business was has slowly begun to be a part of older businesses. These things are partially merged with the existing paint shop. Another instance talks about an interesting form of propagation of grocery shops that was happening. There was one interesting thing that was happening in my town during the lockdown. Only daily necessity goods like grocery shops, dairies, and medical stores were allowed to stay open. As a result, many people in my town placed a request to license their establishment as a grocery shop or medical shop. There were only 5 to 6 grocery shops that had emerged in the last decade, but during this 6 months of the lockdown, there were about 38 new grocery shops that got established with proper licenses. Again, the house, work, neighborhood, public, private, home were all morphing through portals, extensions, vending machines, markets on wheels, and society markets, which were all the new emerging transactions, spatialities one began to see through the glossary. While there was an economic collapse with the loss of jobs, there was also new skill set driven work which was becoming new jobs. Production of goods and services that could be produced at home were in the forefront. The cottage industry form of making returned from the making of mass edibles and through small startups, where the concept of gharguti business, a home business, another term from the glossary, was fast emerging. Similarly, new rental demands by a certain class of people around markets in order to capture smaller opportunities to make money was another instance that was changing the spatiality with these emergent economies. The digital and the hybrid forms were creating strange slippages in the time of the virus. I would like to now call Mumal to go through a few more narrative spheres.
Hi, just give me a minute. Yeah. Thank you, Astavita. Can everybody hear me fine? Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'll go through some boards as well. Firstly, I'd like to start with the one that talks about spatial and temporal reconstructions. Our world exists from meanings that are constantly constructed and reconfigured through this pandemic, which has deconstructed some meanings and multiplied others for us. The fabric of the city not only implies its fragmented geography, but also acts as a storehouse for community and fiction, for imagination and documentary. I would like to talk through some of these reconfigurations by starting with an entry on anticipation and uncertainty. When a screen becomes your window and things happen so unexpectedly, it felt like a sane act to expect and anticipate, only to fail. What ended up happening is that I just anticipate the unknown, only to be proven wrong on what will happen next. One long day, one long night. Another entry speaks about the digital spatial networks rooted in the physicality of our homes. These devices, computer, laptop, tablet, were usually thought as common resources which could be used in turns and was usually regulated as per everyone's daily routines, work and school timings. Also, the dependencies wasn't so much, and its requirement was highly limited in many cases. So a family working with these constraints have started to generate new routines, which are solely based on the availability of these devices, and a whole new range of schedules have emerged, working part-time the whole day. From here onwards, I'd like to shift to an important aspect of public space in the pandemic. What happens when you bar the public population almost from public spaces? What happens to the largest rail and road networks, midday meal school programs? What happens to working hours and spatiality of our social lives that extend and may entirely dwell outside our homes? Does the public then become more localized and relational? If yes, so then would the materiality of public space become actually rather reformulate into our balconies, terraces, grocery vendors, desktops, screens, and entrances? Let us then use this idea of public as a provocation to ask questions about these newly formulated spaces. Can public space exist outside of these chance encounters it provides? How much does our own movement define the publicness of these spaces? Some of these entries speak about this dilemma of what it means to have two distinct but increasingly overlapping ideas of inside and outside. Earlier, there were two worlds, outside and the inside. The outside here refers to things beyond our homes, the schools, colleges, temples, markets, and other public spaces. The lockdown forced us to rethink the idea of home, where everything got assimilated inside the four borders of a house. Also interesting to note is the people started claiming spaces where the windows were always coveted. Our entire world got confined to this one window or one corner. The change in which conversations took place is also something to think about. Balconies, verandas, and terraces have become the new street, and we have started conversing hermetically. Lockdown made me realize that before this pandemic, I have never really lived in my house. The house was just a place I used to come back to, usually tired and exhausted most of the time. Just rest and eat. Most of my life happened outside of the school, where I study in and with my classmates. These new spatial temporal reconfigurations are not entirely comprehensible to us right now, but we have started in some ways to look at the layers of complexity that layer on top of each other. With the idea of essentiality in material and space has trumped the rest, as we can see through the increasing transformation of multiple usage within these spaces. Within these reconfigurations, there are also now new emerging forms of crime, new offenses, new public etiquettes. All of them are dictated by authoritative safety protocols and distancing as their primary baseline. A few entries speak of the various instances within these new categories. I was shocked and a bit taken aback to see that once mobile shop called All Repairs has now been changed to Aiden Bakery. And they were selling all grocery items like milk bag, fruits, vegetables, biscuits. I went further ahead and asked the owner that how did he manage to do it? He responded saying that jugaad is important. He contacted the other grocery store shop owner and bought half of his stock and started to sell them through his store. He also managed to make a board of bakery. So if any police officer came on rounds, he wouldn't be caught. Behind in a corner, he was still running his mobile repair shop. He saw this as an opportunity for expanding his business. Another entry speaks about, it was never a big deal to cough or sneeze on a regular basis. As the days passed by, I observed that sneezing or coughing person is treated suspiciously, even though he or she is not a COVID patient. Earlier, we used to have fever, cough on a regular basis due to weather change or excess humidity, but now it has become an offense to sneeze or cough. When I was clicking a picture of my friends while wearing masks and keeping safe distance from each other, a superior police officer saw us talking and clicking pictures and took us all to the station and started assuming that we are clicking pictures to make fun of him. He asked us, why did we click a picture? Why were we laughing so much? Another incident was when I was in a walk to click pictures of my thesis and was again stopped by a different police officer and again asked the same questions. आप क्या BMC से हो? Are you from the municipal corporation? अगर BMC से नहीं हो तो क्यों फोटो ले रहे हो? If you're not from the municipal corporation, then why are you clicking pictures? We are in the middle of these very strange but mundane changes. They are fundamentally structural to our cities, mixing geography, economics, vision, greed, infrastructure, and privilege. And amidst all this, the revived, newly formed solidarities and networks have been of the utmost importance. Ideas of collective participation and decentralized interventions have acted as bridges. Some of these points have also been highlighted by Vastu's presentation, but we have witnessed our systems and forms slip and leak and reconstitute new socio-spatial hierarchies. They are fragmented, fragile, and temporary. But at this very moment, ask us very important questions about what and how these alternative imaginations look like. Network and support meant different online, in neighborhoods, at home, in Zoom classrooms. It meant different for women, frontline workers, sanitation workers, and migrants. I'd like to put forth some brief instances as such. When the lockdown began, 76-year-old Anjali Gupte traveled to Dadar to bring her 83-year-old relative, Sarla Pradhan, who lives alone in a chawl in Mumbai, home. She was worried about Sarla's social networks being severed because of the lockdown. She decided to ask Sarla to live with them till the lockdown eased. On the other hand, Joshi auntie, who's in the mid-20s, always sat in a balcony for long hours and waved at passerby neighbors. She expected all of them to visit her and chat with her. Just before the pandemic, she moved out to her nephew's house as no one else was there to take care of her. The neighbors realized that she ain't coming back anytime soon. So some of them started growing a garden on her balcony grill, suggesting the other neighbors to visit and now take care of her garden. While I'm privileged to have a safe environment at home, a lot of people found the outside to be safe. A lot of news, not mainstream media, spoke about various people getting harassed in their own homes, spoke about number of COVID cases in the country and the people who died because of it. At one point, all of this got too overwhelming to read. It can take a toll on your mental health. Another strong feeling was loneliness. Despite by being surrounded by 4 family members, where there are times where I felt lonely, maybe because I was the only one who stayed up doing my college work, or probably because I hadn't seen anyone for 8 months. It does not seem like a big deal because the college lectures and Zoom calls kept me connected, but the essence of physical touch was lost. So by default, we have reconstituted these different spaces and a new kind of multiplicity has emerged within house economies, social networks, institutions of care, especially as we see throughout the second wave, where social media was actually the catalyst in bridging gaps in our public healthcare systems. These gaps haven't been limited to our hospitals and policies, but throughout rental markets, judiciary, ideas of welfare and services. Even though our recent response to the pandemic feels more like a quick fix here and there, collective-based interventions have come as crucial aid. Mobile testing vans, drive-in oxygen refill centers, mosques as hospitals, WhatsApp groups. New forms of delivery mechanisms are all but examples of these leaks of the system, which require rethinking as well as repairing. Here, I'd like to leave this board up and Prasad can take over. Just a minute.
Thanks, Vastavikta and Mumal. Thanks. I mean, I invite you to kind of, yeah, this is one one of Thanks. I mean, it kind of continues to become an interesting set of noise, actually. So thanks, Vastu and Mumal. I'll take a few minutes to point at some broad patterns that the glossary and the exhibition are showing at the moment. We see 4 broad reconfigurations that seem to be consolidating in our everyday. First, definitely a spatio-temporal reconfiguration. Vastu and Mumal have already spoken through a few narratives about this in when they presented. Here, the idea of home seems to have collapsed in many cases. I mean, for a large number of people living here in this city in very small houses, the street, the neighborhood, their workplaces was the home. The small room where the household lived was simply a place to keep things. The outside, which became the home, shut down suddenly, actually. And then what happens to this personality? There's a collapse of this idea of home, the outside as a home. At the same time, the digital became the home for many people. I myself and all people from our school must have been spending, I think, around 50% of our time online last year. We meet, chat, discuss. We almost live here, actually. The digital has also opened up geographies and temporalities in ways that it has been never before. Most of us experience meetings at strange hours, and our contact with the world seems to have suddenly increased. But there is also a digital divide thing. I mean, with very high digital divide, many have also suddenly become homeless. So the digital has become home. There is also a case of homelessness, because I mean, there are stories after stories. Yesterday itself, saw this 13-year-old who's unable to attend classes because there's only one internet device in the house, which is the mobile phone, which the father uses. The physicality of the public space and the public institution, which all of us cherished, has also come under interrogation. Does getting used to the new normal mean giving up the physicality of this realm, physicality of the public? Also, at the same time, humanity demonstrated its crudeness through some of the stories. I mean, you can go through the stories where people created segregated based on class boundaries, and figured out ways to put maids, drivers, guards on the front line. They would transact through them. Send somebody to buy vegetables, send somebody to kind of open doors for you. So you had a layer of people who became boundaries. The second reconfiguration is that of a sensorial reconfiguration. The dependence on the eye and the ear has substantially increased. And what we hear and see are largely mediated sounds and images, mediated through the digital. The senses of smell and taste, have literally been affected. The virus affects sense of sense, but it is also affected. And also along with it is the sense of touch. I mean, I really miss the smell and touch of the city. Really. The sense mind seemed to become anxious. Hopefully it will not collapse. Otherwise we'll become a species with the least senses there. Moreover, the pandemic has also created imaginations of vulnerabilities, very close to real vulnerabilities. Many things get shaped here. There is one story I remember where a family washed currency notes with soap water along with all fruits and vegetables and dried them in the oven. And the new notes shed color. So it was kind of, you didn't know how to look at that story. The third reconfiguration is that of the institutional reconfiguration. The cities of Mumbai and Delhi experienced the worst breakdown of health infrastructure. Finding a hospital bed and medication had become a horror. At the moment, there is a shortage of vaccine in the country, apparently because orders were not placed on time. Education system, on the other hand, have also cracked. This year, the exams were cancelled en masse. Nobody knows what happens next. I must say that for some of us, it has given us an opportunity to rethink education and pedagogy and academia completely, actually, because something which we have been saying since quite some time seem to be working better than the university-led formal education system. Governance has also failed. There are a series of stories where the police has been managing streets using brute force. Approvals, licensing, insurances, and everything else has stuck. Moreover, no one has any ideas on how to restart one's socioeconomic life or how to kind of run one's socioeconomic life, how to manage finances. And no advisor is telling that. India has a lot of financial advisors all over the place. There are so many people who kind of advise. India also saw the largest interstate movement of workers who left cities. They had nothing left, no home, no work, nothing. Plus, there was a fear of life. They literally walked away from cities and undertook very, very long journeys back to places which they thought would be their homes. The glossary also records numerous instances of smaller compassions, friendships, and solidarities. So while you have modern institutions cracking, those institutions which are supposed to hold us, those cracking, you have small forces which were holding together. And I think it's a very important thing to kind of realize what we fall back to at these moments. It's these smaller compassions, friendships, mutualities, and solidarities which held us. Plenty of support groups, smaller networks, hack practices have emerged. I mean, many of us have all kinds of personal experiences here. And the last reconfiguration, the fourth one, is the reconfiguration in work and living. So while there are plenty of stories of loss of jobs and enterprises, there are also stories of intensifications in many practices. Some of the black marketing of some goods have substantially intensified. Transactions have changed. And so has the configuration of transactional spaces. Probably the idea of office, the office space, will become extinct in the next few years. Probably. It kind of, it's already looking irrelevant. I'll invite everybody to visit the glossary and exhibition at your own convenience and walk through it. It's kind of dense and intense, and it's kind of it is at some moments it holds you, at some moments it makes you cry, at some moments it kind of lifts you, and it does all kinds of things. We will keep building the glossary. We'll figure out ways in which people can add their own, construct their own constellation of narratives. The glossary will keep on growing till the pandemic is there, and the exhibition will also kind of I don't know what the next step of the exhibition will be, because it is difficult to make sense of where we are kind of moving towards. So with that, I'll now invite our guests to respond to a variety of things. We've invited people whose works we admire and with whom we've had long discussions about the pandemic, but also about life and many other things. So my pleasure in inviting Abdul Malik Simon, Mamta Sagar, and Solomon Benjamin today, this evening, to respond to the glossary. To open the responses, I would like to invite Abdul Malik Simon. Malik is an urbanist and a senior professor at the University of, professorial fellow at the University of Sheffield. I know Malik has been part of many constellations of people from across the world discussing the pandemic. I've been also a part of some of these constellations. I think at the moment, if there is any urban scholar who's been able to take on the institutional misreading of cities by its neck and work tirelessly towards developing newer ways of seeing them, it's Abdul Malik Simon. His poetic works bring joy and speaks about the energy in the otherwise sterile field of urban studies that appears to be so burdened with policy and planning discussions. His formulation of people as infrastructure has been seminal in reorienting urban studies across the world. Malik.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Prasad, for that generous, very generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here with you and Rapali today, everyone. And also with my preferred co-conspirator, Sally Benjamin. So I want to just say a few things about the form of the glossary, as a particular moment of reading and the time of the glossary. So it's fairly some sort of fairly idiosyncratic remarks, but it is directed toward the sort of the shape of the glossary, trying to navigate it, trying to understand the kind of temporality involved. And so, we know well all of the things that don't come to light, or rather we cannot know those things as more than glimmers, not whole-formed events or entities. All of the stories the city tells about itself that never become stories about the city. All of the things that emerge, these momentary fragments that somehow never are framed, never are able to take full narrative shape. And stories that actively refuse the privileging of specific kinds of narrators. Stories that are unruly, wild, that can't be tamed. And we may always try to construct the official stories about what we are, about where and how we live, but we're never fully immune from stories about us that seem to come from unknown origins, that everyone seems to know, something casting shadows aside the scrutiny of official bodies, rendering us complicit in insurgencies, playing parts and roles that we cannot account for. Stories happening now. And in some ways, I see these sort of fragments, these emerging from the glossary as these kinds of stories that are somehow overly, that are sometimes that are familiar, that are intimate, but yet something that can't really be completely framed, domesticated, narrated in any kind of sustained logical way. So Walter Benjamin often wrestled with his dialectics of the standstill, that somehow the continuous unfolding of possibilities could only come together in the interruptions of temporalities, some speeding ahead, fading behind, circling back, and veering off, where they all converge in the now, something that was taken from a background of both endless possibilities, but also deterministic constraints. For the history of that moment, that now, is unprecedented and cannot be reduced to a repetition. Whatever has constituted that moment is fully within it, in a way not dissimilar as being in the groove, something that remains fundamentally unsettled, loose, where booty is shaken and not collected as property. To be in the now is a long way from being in the know, as things are coming at you from all directions. To be in the groove means to be stuck in a continuous call-response mode, whose repetition means that there isn't any sense of forward progress. The interaction, the call, the response, it's not proceeding to some consensual or even contested destination, but rather that time stands still, even with feet moving, because there's nowhere in particular to go. It's just the call, the response, the call, the response in the groove. So when a convener of a Zoom workshop of 300 attendees that I experienced during the past months instructed people to get into the groove by turning their cameras on, it is possible to think of such an invocation as defeating the purpose of being in the groove. Because when cameras are off, it allowed anyone to speculate as to what was taking place behind the scenes. All of the domestic, banal, frivolous activities concealed by the mark of a name on the black box. All of the illicit backdoor conversations taking place between strangers, sometimes using fake accounts to proposition each other with outlandish requests. All of those mixed up times and places not formally defined that could either assure any participant that their most secret desires might find a way home, or that everyone simply now dwelled in a kind of common oblivion. In some contexts, the groove of the now was critical, as you all are aware. All of the social capital that one might have accumulated, all of the connections and privileges that could be mobilized in order to facilitate access largely proved irrelevant to the actual ability to get hold of beds, oxygen, medicine. So in an intersection of memory, faint impressions, WhatsApp messages, dogged circulations, chasing down reports and rumors, and the most blatant of seductions, opportunities for access could suddenly present themselves for a brief moment where things were available now and then no longer. And nothing could prepare one for occupying and being in that now. There were no maps about how to get there, no privileged algorithms that could take you to that now. Things appeared in a flash, a sudden convergence of the fortuitous, the accidental, and logistical, a now that could not be held or sustained, but only zoomed in on. And a now that is now put on hold in many ways, or the ability to get hold of things in the now. And both senses, to be put on hold and to get hold of something now, acts to destabilize the very notion of the hold. For all of the George Floyds held down, for all of the lives put on hold, for all of those desperate callers wanting medical treatment put on hold, and for all of those epidemiological procedures unable to really hold the virus at bay, the sense of being in anything, to be in the city, in the house, in the groove, in the moment, dependent is on a demarcation or bordering, a sense of being able to draw lines around and between something, increasingly does not hold. If a large volume of everyday transactions seem to obscure geography, where anyone can seem to reach anywhere, and if the configuration of supposedly safe operational spaces or spaces of domestication prove increasingly to be traps, overrun with indebtedness, toxic intimacies, contagion, gender violence, and excessive obligation, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine an arrangement capable of holding things together aside larger measures of coercion. Not to downplay the sort of mutual solidarities and reciprocities that took place, but we do face a kind of sense of things being held together predominantly through new forms and new volumes of coercion. For the hold, whatever this hold is a locus of shared affection. It's both the story of individuals with their own desires and histories that come to hold on to each other for dear life, to make life endearing, and the intersection of disparate ways of taking hold, of extracting, of taking things from, taking resources, sentiments, capacities. So this hold is in some sense, the notion of holding things together is a kind of ambiguous time and ambiguous space, both of intimacy, but also of extraction. So just as the pandemic required individuals to get a hold on themselves, coupled with a reliance on the household as the locus for holding things in place, the predominant mode of sociality is signaled by email messages, email message reminders reminding receivers of events happening now. And even if these events are identified as taking place somewhere, they are operationalized as occurring nowhere, and often in a way by availing themselves to a larger public. Anyone can register, anyone can participate, that forego attempts to steer their potential impact across specific sectors or geographies. So even we know a kind of event is taking place somewhere, it is open to everywhere. So where is it really taking? Well, it's not clear. And in a kind of event that is producing some sense of knowledge, both somewhere and everywhere, and therefore in some sense nowhere, how do we steer things across specific sectors, specific localities, specific geographies? And this is a situation where the everywhere becomes the nowhere, and the now, a speeded up zone of crashing and cascading fragments, which do not so much take Benjaminian leaps into new flashes of unprecedented possibility, but oftentimes simply are reduced to a mimic of constant profusions of memes and GIFs. Perhaps gifts, but gifts become gifts in under maybe extraordinary circumstances. But nevertheless, and I finish here, the glossary, this glossary is really an accomplishment of adjacency. And I use that word from the work of the African-American cultural theorist Tina Camp, who has written much on this notion of adjacency. Because adjacency is in some ways a kind of, I think, increasingly critical issue of our pandemic time. That is, what happens when things are right next to each other? What happens when things have a kind of physical proximity, but yet somehow don't connect? Where that notion of proximity doesn't mean that things necessarily have anything any longer to do with each other. That they are adjacent, but not connected. And so adjacency is something that has to be attained, has to be accomplished. The making of relations in spite of and because of the differences of experiences and power. Something which is not empathy for the other. There's been a lot of talk about, particularly in Brazil, about the kind of collapse of any kind of empathy, the willingness on the part of a regime to let so many hundreds of thousands of people die, the kind of absence of empathy on the part of the elite but this adjacency, it's not having to do with empathy, but an acknowledgement that there is no words or feelings sufficient to do the work of translation or to put yourself into someone else's shoes. Rather, adjacency is always to confront and address the divergences, the extensiveness of unacknowledged suffering, and to rework the possibilities of proximity. For there is always something else besides what we know. And so what I find so valuable in part of this glossary is the work of this adjacency, the dogged work of trying to make things connect, to speak to each other in ways which doesn't assume the possibilities of effective empathy, but is working to make that kind of connection possible. So I thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have been part of this major, a small part of this major project.
Thanks, Simon. That's beautiful. I mean, thank you so much. I mean, the idea of being in the now, being different from being in the no, living through the groove and the slippages of the groove, and the no maps of the now, and the bringing in of the the Benjaminian leap, in these moments, and the idea of adjacencies and something which I feel we've been also closely, thinking through. And it's so refreshing to kind of, think this way also. Like, look at this incoherence, if I may say, and this incoherence, the impossibility of kind of of being able to handle the incoherence. But then what do? Then you kind of work out newer ways of engaging, because the moment you try to hold that incoherence, it just slips between your fingers. Like and how does one kind of work with this incoherence, and your work and all people in this panel, their works, they speak so much about this impossibility of holding the city through larger ideas, but through these through smaller nut bolts of simultaneity, mutuality, solidarity, adjacency. Kind of work with these softer, energetic, reflective, but also instrumental, these kind of forces, really small forces. and thanks thank you very much to kind of bringing this to this panel. Actually, I want to now invite Mamta Sagar for her responses. Mamta Sagar is a poet, a writer, and a literary scholar, and if I may say, a cultural activist based in Bangalore. She's a professor of academic and creative writing at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology. Being in conversation with her, you can find that Mamta has an acute sense of politics and rooted in the cultural landscapes that are connected to politics. She's been a part of many feminist and cultural movements. And I should mention, she also wrote poems for Gauri on Gauri Lankesh. Mamta.
Thank you, Prasad. Thanks for having me today with this wonderful gathering and such a beautiful work. I would like to first begin by congratulating Vastavikita and Mumal for this wonderful exhibition. It's amazing. I have been going through it, I've been seeing it. And it has full of stories. And these constellations, in a way, it is kind of a metaphor referring to experiences that occur and exist simultaneously. And sometimes, you think that our story is something very big, but there are many other things that are happening all around us. And this particular thing gives you that experience that there is everything in this world simultaneously happening. And there are people reaching out, there are people needed to be reached out and who have been reached out. And those stories have been translated into the exhibition. So I am one person who believes that these translations, translation in the sense, an experience, a text can be translated into any form. It could be translated into a work of art. It could be translated into a piece that has to be kept in the museum. So whatever has been translated here, I believe that translations always, say more than what the original has to say. So these stories, as somebody, one of you, Vastavita or Momal, was saying that whenever, or maybe Prasad, whoever reaches a story, the story is reached by many people in many different ways. The readings are completely different. So the translations of these stories, presentation of these stories gives you diverse perspectives, and I have enjoyed it. According to Brazilian translation study scholars, cannibalism, they talk about cannibalism. Cannibalism is like, like many other things in this world, even cannibalism was understood, I'm not supporting it, but it was understood as something that has to be completely forgotten, as should not exist in a given culture. But translation study scholars say that translating is like consuming the text. So the minute you consume the text exists until and unless you are there. So this exhibition has given life and allowing many, many stories to exist. I don't know for how long. And people have contributed such beautiful things into this. I would specifically mention 5 stories here from the show, which is one is Padmakar, who is a 84-year-old artist. Actually, he goes to his son's place and he has forgotten doodling and all that. And now Padmakar again starts sketching. He reinstalls himself as an artist. the work of art comes back through Padmakar. So each individual explores, re-explores many things in their lives. And the other one is around masking, it's called masking or something. I just loved that visual. Masking, about masks, the way the masks have been used, and also the performance around mask, the blue mask performances, they are really, really attractive. And all these presentations, I mean, in the exhibition are socio-politically very important, because you get to see what is happening around us, and the entire COVID vocabulary, the vocabulary that this pandemic and lockdown has brought to us has been applied in these exhibition. And the third one is Ketiwadi, helping and learning farming is something which I also liked, because people have been doing that, they have been trying hands-on with various new possibilities, new things. They are trying to do that. And here are people who go back to villages. Like, as you know, Bengaluru is going through horrible times right now. And we have been seeing all kinds of things. And many of them have moved away from Bangalore to outskirts, villages, where, they have been doing a lot of farming and helping the communities. So rekindling friendship is also something which is really, really important. And these 5 I consider as core elements of the exhibition, which connects to all other exhibits and all other texts. That text, when I mean text is also visual. Everything that has been displayed in the gallery, in the glossary. So rekindling friendship, which has been happening, friends from nowhere have come up in our WhatsApp groups, in Facebook, whatever. And now, people who are disappearing, who are dying, and people, we have been able to help people because you have found them back. You don't want to lose them, or before you have found them, you're losing them. And you're finding new kinds of friendships, kinships, new communities, groups. And this exhibition holds all of these. And the whole notion of belonging is discussed all through the exhibition. Belonging, where do you belong? How do you belong? Whether you belong or not. If you don't belong, then what is the displacement? What kind of confinements are we going through? What kinds of breaking barriers is happening? And why are these happening? See, all these online meetings, screenshots, spinning, speaker mode, the gallery mode. See, this has become, I would not want to again repeat that, because already Prasad has told that we have been spending 50% of our time over the, caged within the square of this box. And so, all these elements have become part and parcel of our day-to-day conversations. So, and during pandemic and the lockdown, as a facilitator, I have done many projects and many classes. I would like to present 2 of them to this august audience. So one was, I did a poetry installation as art. And this was already declared, and then came the lockdown. Then how would we do this poetry installation as art? Because I have been doing public installations. We are presentations in public spaces with communities, with transgender, with marginalized communities, in the markets, everywhere I have been working with my groups, Suddenly with the lockdown, then the whole concept of performance and installation becomes really, really a questionable thing. So what I did was, the students were who had this was in the first lockdown, when the students had gone back to their places within their homes. locked up in their rooms. We tried to make use of words were created, visuals were created with whatever they could access around them, within the room, within the imagination, within the balconies, and collect, never go out, but collect whatever was there in the home, right from the kitchen to the office room to study to garden to everywhere, bring things together, put together and make an installation performance. And during that time, few students were going through trauma because in Pune, it was the peak time. And one of my students had lost 5 members in the family. And, it is not just classes, it was also kind of a counseling that we were, as faculty, we have been doing. All of you must be knowing that. This teaching doesn't make any sense now. The entire counseling and sitting with them hours together, talking to them and bringing them back and allowing them to express their sorrows or sadness or fear or whatever through their work was something that taught us. So as faculty, as artists, I think we found new ways of dealing with this world, new ways of dealing with our practice itself through that, and the other thing, for the pandemic, lockdowns opened for a little while. And in the meanwhile, I have been connected with one 8th semester project, which is called Dakshin Dhwani, Stories from South Bangalore. South Bangalore is, if people have visited Bangalore, you will know, South Bangalore is very different from other parts of Bangalore. It is very local, it's very Kannada, it is mostly Brahminical, it is all the so-called Bengaluru essence are stuck there, right from Tipu Sultan's summer palace. So why I'm bringing Tipu Sultan is Tipu has become a political figure. Always Tipu has done a lot of things, because Girish Karnad was blamed by the right wing for requesting that the airport could be named after Tipu. So, but it was named after Kempegowda, that is fine. So Tipu is a controversial figure always, and during pandemic it becomes more controversial because around Tipu Palace there is this KR market, the whole large community of Muslims residing around. It doesn't mean that only Muslims are there, there are other people. So Tipu Palace, Lal Bagh and Basavan Gudi, within the triangle we started working, and students have we visited the sites thrice. Students went few more times, and then was the lockdown. So after that, we have been working on this, and Stories of South Bangalore is coming out, and they have been meeting people, and all online sessions, all the expertise were brought to talk to the students. Why I am saying talking about my teaching as well, because the kind of works that are available and the kind of sensibilities that the COVID glossary is invoking is something which is very, very important for all of us, especially for us as teachers to go through, and because teaching now is beyond syllabi, as Prasad was also mentioning. So with this, we have been using video recordings, audios, live presentations, home studios. Studios have become, home has become studios, and the whole notion of self and the other is being replaced by the self itself. The self is also the other. The image that you see in the mirror and the image that you see on the screen, the self has become the multiple other. So the whole understanding of the other, the political other, has become more crucial, because now self has taken over that space of the other also. You're so more engaged with the self, it is essential to talk about the other as well. But as you know, you cannot avoid talking about the other, because our country always keeps you on toes to realize that how the other is being recreated on and on and on. And now as a practitioner, I would like to, and new stereotypes have been coming up. Breaking the it began with the breaking of the stereotypes and identifying new stereotypes. And these new stereotypes are yet to be known and seen and engaged with. And see, as a practitioner of poetry, performance, and visual medium, I somehow connect these lockdowns with spaces not allowed for communities to voice, as an alternative space found by these suppressed voices. Because I would somehow, because I am in India at this point of time, I am connecting today's lockdown with CAA, NRC, then whatever has happened because of that, the Shaheen Bagh, Bilal Bagh in Bangalore. And with these, the understanding of space as a concept was already altered. And with the lockdown, everything was locked down. And the spaces which the center or the right wing wanted to lock down has been completely locked down. Okay. And during these times, I also translated Hum Dekhenge by Fayaz Ahmed Fayaz, and which went viral. And so the whole understanding of love right now, I would always think that, yes, pandemic is because of COVID virus spreading. It is a disease, but it has led to that. The whole time and space that led to this pandemic and closing down of everything is somehow, and because, we also know that this whole pandemic and the lockdown was very efficiently used to arrest people who questioned, voiced against the citizenship. So pandemic is not independent, lockdown is not independent, the history lies there, and we cannot forget that. And most of the works that have been put up in your glossary reminds of all of these, the narratives reminds of all of this. And it's very important because people have been already feeling insecure because of the disease, because of the COVID virus, because of various things, more than anything because of the governance. And it is very important for us to realize that. So understanding of space as a concept has been altered. Public space, private space, physical space, virtual space, community space, and nation space. So all these space have been altered, have been questioned, have been looked at in a different way, have been revisited, and it's something which is very different that has been happening. So during these times, I have been attending many poetry festivals, meetings, discussions, academic and creative, both online. Okay. So in a way, I find that the shrunken self, and I loved that work, I really loved that particular work. I think it was put up by Vastvika. I don't right now, I don't remember. The shrunken self and the concept of liberation have come together. In a way, like you have been all over the city, you have been talking about, there was activism, there was protests, everywhere you are there, and now you are completely shrunken into this square, but you are liberated. You can speak, you can talk, you can tell whatever you want. There is, of course, the moral policing is there. It's everywhere, even right from your windows and your cameras, things would come on you, but still, the shrunken self and the concept of liberation have come together during pandemic. So I also curate Kavya Sanjay, an event, a poetry event it's a multilingual poetry event. I started this because for the Kannada young poets who were who are amazing poets, but because they could not access English, because they could not access non-Kannada spaces, they could not, in a way, be introduced. But Kavya Sanjay was happening in public spaces. But once it came, once the lockdown came, we have been doing series of events. I think every week we did last year, and amazing Kannada poets read with very important poets from all over the world. You know, they were appreciated and they got an exposure. We got an exposure as Kannada writers, and internationally, the Indian languages, including English, writers from here have done a lot and have been connecting. These connections are happening during this time. And I also curated an event and an exhibition at Piccolo Museo della Poesia in Italy. I co-curated it with an Italian artist, where we brought in 250 poets. I brought 28 poets from India, from 15 languages, and their videos and voices were presented. And yeah, like when I was going through the glossary, I was also thinking that it's in an old church, and we have been, we looped the readings, and the voices were heard, and the poems, handwritten poems, have been displayed. You know, maybe, you know, I will come back to you, and I think you should help us do something like this to sustain that exhibition. And I also did a lot of festivals, and you know, I learned many things. I learned editing. I learned Premiere Pro. I did a lot of poetry videos. You know, it's fun. It's not just depressing. You know, this has multi-dimensional kind of an aspect to your conceptual this thing. You know, creative conceptual mind. So with this space, I would now like to present one Vachana. Vachanas are from 12th century. You can go back and look what Vachanas are. Vachana was a period Vachana period where people from beyond all caste, class thing, they constructed poetry. So here is a poem by one Bontha Devi. I believe she was a Kashmiri princess who came to Karnataka and married someone. I am a Kannada poet, and this is a Kannada Vachana. I will read the translation later. I would like to read the Kannada first. ಊರ ಒಳಗಣ ಬಯಲು, ಊರ ಹೊರಗಣ ಬಯಲೆಂದುಂಟೆ, ಊರೊಳಗೆ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ ಬಯಲು, ಊರ ಹೊರಗೆ ಹೊಲೆಯ ಬಯಲೆಂದುಂಟೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದಡೆ ಬಯಲೆಂದ ಭಿತ್ತಿಯಿಂದ ಒಳ ಹೊರಗೆಂಬ ಮಾಯಿಸೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದಡೆ ಕರೆದಡೆ ಓ ಎಂಬಾತನೆ ಬಿಡಾಡಿ. Bidadi is her pen name. Is there such a thing as the space inside the town and the space outside the town? Is there such a thing as the Brahmin space inside the town, the Holaya space outside the town? Space is the same wherever you are. Space is the same wherever you are. It is the wall of your body which names it inside and outside. He who answers your call anywhere is Bidadi. So the sight and the sight, the parallel sights, videos, what you see, the sight space and the parallel sights, parallel visuals, these have been, it has been possible for us to realize the outside and the inside, both philosophically and also actually materialistically. These whole concepts have been challenged, changed, and re-understood, recreated. That has been a very important element of this time, you know, an important metaphor, an important element, an important actual during pandemic lockdowns. And it's become it's become almost like a everyday practice, you know. We are not bothered because tomorrow you feel bad because there are so many people are dying, you know, they are dying because they're not getting oxygen, not getting ambulance, not getting beds. But castes in India have been cashing on this. I don't understand where this social distancing came. The word social distancing came. It's actually physical distancing, It's so easy for Indians who had this caste system intact and always want it to thrive and sustain, to use social distancing. So social distancing in India is not just social distancing. It helps people enjoy to sustain this caste or gender or whatever kind of distancing we have been practicing, So the social distancing is understood on the basis of caste system. And so literally that recently, you don't believe it, few days back, there is an area called Malleshwaram in Bangalore. It's an old area, all the Brahmins had a special vaccination center. They came with panche, nama, madi, kache and all and got vaccinated. And they were proud to do that. And we allowed this thing to happen. And this is happening during pandemic, So, and Tejasvi Surya, the RSS Swayam Sevak and a member of parliament, victimized Muslim COVID warriors in Bangalore and did a whole big hangama. Within a week, his uncle was caught in the money-making scam through COVID vaccines. Okay, and BJP hoardings claimed that free food and refreshments were arranged for people attending the funerals. This was put up near, where people were, how can I forget? See, I'm so upset. Where people are burnt and whatever. Okay, so it was put up there, and the banner displayed on behalf of the local BJP leader had smiling images of the great Prime Minister and all the party members. This drew criticism after the photograph of the same it went viral, So this is the place we are living in. And amidst all of these, unavailable of oxygen cylinders, beds, vaccines, deaths of friends and family, these times are teaching us to survive. I would now like to conclude my response with a poem written by me very recently. I will first read the Kannada and then read the translation. ಬಿಡಿಸಲಾಗದ ಹಾಡು ಒಂದು ಮೋಡ ತೇಲಿ ಬಂತು ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಪೆನ್ಸಿಲ್ಲಿನ ದಪ್ಪ ಸೀಸದ ಮೊನಚು ತುದಿ ಮೊಂಡಾದಂತೆ ಮೋಡ ದುಂಡಗೆ ದಟ್ಟವಾಗುತ್ತಾ ಕಂದಾಗುತ್ತಾ ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಮಬ್ಬು ಕವಿದಿತ್ತು ಸುಯಿ ಗುಡದ ಸುಂಟರ ಗಾಳಿ ತರಗೆಲೆಗಳು ಸರ ಬರ ಅನ್ನದು ಕಾದ ಮಣ್ಣು ಘಮಗುಡುವ ನೆನಪು ದನಿ ಗುಡುಗಿ ಹನಿ ಬಿತ್ತು ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೂ ಗಾಳಿ ಬೀಸಿ ಅಕ್ಕ ಪಕ್ಕದ ಬಳ್ಳಿಗಳಿಂದ ಅರಳದ ಮೊಗ್ಗುಗಳುದುರಿ ಹಾಳೆ ತುಂಬ ಅಕ್ಷರಗಳು ಚದುರಿ ಮನದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಳುಕಲಾರದ ತರಂಗಗಳು ಮೂಡಿತ್ತು ಖಾಲಿ ಹಾಳೆಯ ಕಪ್ಪು ಮೋಡದ ಬೀಳದ ಮಳೆಯ ಬಿದ್ದ ಅಕ್ಷರಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬಿಡಿಸಲಾಗದ ಹಾಡು ಸಿಲುಕಿತ್ತು. Now the translation. The poem is translated by me. Trapped song. A cloud came floating over an empty page. As the sharpness of the pencil blunts, clouds thicken, roundness grays deeper, casting a gloom upon the page. Whirlwind doesn't whoosh. Rustling of the leaves not heard. Scent of the moist soil recurs as memory. Voice rumbles, pitter-pat drizzles drop. Over the page, wind whispers. Flower buds from creepers around fall as letters tossed on the page. Ripples in mind's expanse refuse to spill over upon the empty page. Within the dark clouds, in the rains that pour not, in pouring letters, a song gets trapped beyond portrayal. Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mamta, for one bringing Bedadi's Vachana, and then of course your own poem, and also kind of speaking so many things about about the situation and the country in so many ways, I should say. At moments bringing yourself, and at moment bringing the activities that you do, but also hiding within it the time bombs that you kind of keep exploding, every time. Thanks. In the morning we were discussing. We had a studio presentation in the morning, and the studio was challenging because it was to build a space and and present it digitally, and what would it mean to kind of build something and present it digitally. And for us it was very difficult. For a year almost we've been thinking, how do you teach architecture which is such a physicality to kind of work with the digital space, and I think through the year we discovered the problems of the categories of digital, physical, or the emotional space, or the tangible space, intangible space. These categories probably are unnecessary completely, because our concentration on physicality of space is basically lending ourselves to the transactional idea of space. Physical space is property. Physical space brings about permanence. Physical space brings about privacy. It's at the core of transactability. And you see that when you mix the self, the questions of identity, the questions of the digital, emotional, into that, you kind of remove it from those anchors of privacy, property, and permanence, and then kind of figure out ways to leave it. I think the pandemic provides us this opportunity to look at ourselves very closely, look at what we lived, what we are living with, and what ideas we are living with. I'm missing Shweta Sarda here, a very dear friend who couldn't attend today, and I was hoping that she brings her practice of intellectual care, which is having developing ideas over long conversations, and anyway, Shweta will join us in other times. I would like to now invite Solomon Benjamin. Solly, I think at the moment, Solly is the most interesting urbanist in the country. There's no doubt about it. He teaches us at IIT Madras, IIT Chennai, and lives in Bangalore. He's a very close friend, and we've been companions in many journeys. I think the formulation of occupancy urbanism has been critical in rethinking urban studies beyond the optics of policy and meta-narratives. And Solly's perpetual high energy inquisitiveness and a complex anti-institutional spirit is what drives the work. Solly's work would remind one of Mark Lombardi's circuitries, those complex diagrams that try to connect every piece of the world together and to kind of mobilize it and kind of put 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 those complex narratives together. Solomon Benjamin. Sorry.
Yeah, hello. I think I'm just going to move to another room because the connection is better. I'm sorry, I just realized the. Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. And just as I moved, I just realized that I left my little notebook in the next room, but I don't want to stop this. But I think, well, thank you very much for this occasion. And I'm not being polite, but really in terms of what has just struck me is through these works and earlier two times of seeing this evolve, through the exhibition and the amount of work that has gone in. I mean, from whatever 200 to 400 entries, in a sense, it's like a city itself. And I think the sort of important point of, coming just after two really poetic presentations is that it kind of shows the power of a kind of poetic spatiality which goes beyond this form of cartographic big data kind of stuff. And I'm building on what Mamta was talking about, and also what Prasad mentioned initially about the collapse of the sort of state in a sense, or a lot of state spaces that people both thought they were going to help them out, but also had faith in, even though they were being disciplined by them. I think the last 2-3 months in particular has kind of shaken that. And I think it's this sort of poetics of spatiality, which I think comes out so powerfully in this glossary. It's not a kind of a positivist kind of planning kind of stuff, and in a sense, I think that's where the sort of political opening lies. And the other thing, just as you were saying, about how do you talk about cities, or how do you, quote unquote, teach about cities? I think this sort of glossary kind of approach and its kind of complexity of openness which it brings in is important, not just for architecture, but I think the way we do social sciences. And I'm sitting in a department of social science and humanities. One has become more and more cartographic, and I'm not just talking about during the pandemic, but even far beyond before that, where everything is getting reduced to very fast, big policy relevance, big data, and the kind of one kind of idea is that you have this kind of disciplining, quote unquote, through the second wave, which is really not about just the second wave of the virus, but really how do you now have, for example, just to give you a very concrete example, 2 or 3 weeks back, because I'm not on Twitter, a good friend of mine, Adip Amin, he sent me his reaction to a crazy Twitter post by a well-known activist who said that, the fact that you had new kind of cartographic logics, including a nodal person or a nodal agency to register, quote unquote, homeless people in Bangalore to line up for the vaccine, and there was a whole set of procedures around that. I mean, this came out in, you can imagine it's a government order of 7 or 8 points. And then clause number 5, right from clause 5.1 to clause 7, has these kind of laid out. And I think that what this what your COVID glossary shows is that there would be a deep suspicion of those kind of, big data clause base, which are, are you happy that it's off the Aadhaar card, which is the unique ID kind of thing, or will it be bringing in another kind of a, kind of cartographic mapping to kind of replace that. And I think what this really shows, in all its kind of unevenness of spatiality, is the, I don't know, for lack of a sort of better term, because this is all on the spot. I think it's the kind of poetics that all of you have kind of emphasized. I mean, it's a poetics which refuses a single narrative. We're not even sure whether there is a coherent narrative, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the problem is that once you have a narrative, then you have a logic exposed. And once you have a logic exposed, then you know how you're going to be able to discipline it and predict it. And, you have enough IT types who are working out algorithms to predict stuff. And as Mamta was saying, is that one should kind of refuse a kind of a very narrow positioning that yes, we're going to get saved by something, and therefore yes, let's be measured and stuff like that. And I think this, hence this kind of possibility where people have begun to, through the really brutal experience of losing near and dear loved ones, and waking up and checking your WhatsApp, and suddenly you find an unexpected person whom you could have never imagined suddenly being very serious. Those kind of shocks, and going through the whole thing, have suddenly reinforced this idea about how do you connect with people, why those connections are important, how do you decide to keep some of them secret, some of them you publicize, you circulate. I think those kind of those kind of learnings, experiential, are far more powerful and political than any kind of sort of teaching system can give you. The other, I mean, and here I'm not kind of sort of diminishing quote unquote the state, and I'll give you two examples. One is example, I have a MA student who's just finishing her master's thesis, wonderful work in two districts of Kerala. One in Idukki, which, as some of you would know, it's a very hilly kind of district, where her mother is posted as a nurse. And another district is Kollam, which is near the sea, and it's also got an island there. And she's looking at how this quote unquote steel frame of the Kerala administration, which we are all admiring as managing COVID very well, does so very differently. And it's interesting, in this so-called hilly district where people have to the health workers have to trudge up the hill to make contact, to kind of materialize, quote unquote, the progressive state policy. It is all coming down to how those personal connections work out, which have a history of other programs which have consolidated those connections. And it's these entanglements which then get reflected in quote unquote better COVID management. And in Kollam, which is obviously, your Wi-Fi works, people have got cell phones, unlike Idukki, which is a hilly place where there's no signal, and therefore you have to trudge up the hill. It sort of works in a very mixed way. And I think so. I mean, I think that's the kind of entanglements of various state spaces, quote unquote policies, and how it's not the centralization of data and big data being collected, but it starts becoming part of those kind of conversations to particularize how, quote unquote, a general medical kind of pandemic starts affecting people in very different constellations of, ways. And another example, and it's a kind of incomplete example, but a couple of weeks back, I was requested by a group of you itself to, explore and arrange some beds in Chennai for a faculty coming out of, Delhi. And it took me about 2 hours of, because I'm in Bangalore and I'm contacting whoever I know in Chennai. But what was interesting is that I was contacting my contacts, not to seek favors, but rather to figure out how is their system working. And they had, the Chennai or the Tamil Nadu administration had set up a system for allocation of beds, for locating them, different categories, so that through a set of phone numbers, so you have an entanglements of, quote unquote, contacts being mobilized, networks being established, but also a particular part of the state sort of working into those in a what one can see as a sort of progressive way, unlike what we're having in Bangalore. And I'm sure there's a lot of problems in Delhi, in that. So, I mean, I think that these kind of imaginations, to break the usual ways of how we see, this cartographic frames of, these World Bank type of good governances and stuff like that. And to really bring it back to this kind of poetic possibilities of entanglements, that's really important. Because I think this, of course, I'm not a poet like both Mamta and Malik. I mean, the two previous presentations were powerful because they were poetic. I think if they were describing hard data and big data and policy, it will be like many of the Zoom programs which are run by the industrial and the lobbies like FICCI and Confederation of Indian Chamber of Commerce on how do we manage the COVID pandemic. I think I'll come back to this. I just want to emphasize your work, which I think is really important to kind of sort of put on the center space the kind of complex kind of play with textures, with form, with drawings, with describing experiences. I think all those really completely overhaul the way we think about cities. And I think it's in one way it's not, it's going to a new kind of frame, and it's going to be very difficult, I think, for master planner types or policy expert types. I think they've kind of lost their legitimacy in many ways, and that's a very good thing. I mean, what does a Niti Aayog type say that, we're going to collect data on the pandemic, or, I mean, they're probably busy, facilitating the Central Vista, or then what's happening in the Andaman, Nicobar Islands, or Lakshadweep. They can do that well. But I think on this kind of a thing, this kind of poetic entanglements completely exposes that politics. So, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks. A variety of things, actually. A variety of things in a sense that, and I think the question of language, the question of form, I think is something which you brought in very, very, very nicely. And I think, I mean, poems, fiction, drawings, they do not easily lend themselves to a techno-legal hijack. You cannot use them in the court. That's what happened. And because you cannot use them in the court and everything around the court kind of, is suspicious and scared and about it, and tries to uh, kind of outcast it, tell it is not relevant because it doesn't follow a traditional logic of causalities and empirical sciences and this and that. So but but uh, uh, I mean, uh, Malik brought in Benjamin, and Mamta brought in Vachanas, Bidadi's Vachana. So I think these remain active and powerful. Benjamin after 100 years, and Vachanas after, I think, almost 800 years, or Ravidas after 1,000 years. I think that because it is that because they hold that the instinctual spirit. It's very interesting. The first poet, like Valmiki is called the first poet, and then basically he's called the first poet because the story is basically, he sees a prince killing two birds while making love, and a curse comes out of him which he does not understand, and that is written as the first poem. That is called the first poem because it comes out of it almost instinctual, quick, as if it is an expression of that, all of that put together. So and I think that's the power of these frames which do not get me. I'm not kind of, I like law very much. I like legal policy documents very much. I think they are also they're fantastic material. My work is all around that. But I think the hijack and lending itself is something which the poems and the fictions don't allow. Whereas they kind of, they remain durable. They remain durable. They don't allow the technological hijack, but they remain long term and durable, and kind of, impact many thoughts and thinkings and all kinds of things. So I think that is a very important point you got in, and of course, the whole dimension of the non-policy disciplines and many more things actually. So what I'll do is now I'll invite my colleague Rupali Gupte, who also teaches at school at the School of Environment and Architecture, to take ahead the conversations. So we have Malik, Mamta, and Solly, but we also have Walter Benjamin and the Vachanas. Okay, so Rupali.
So yeah, I think thank you so much for all the respondents for your presentations. I think Prasad has also summed up a lot of what you've been bringing in. But I think what I would also like to point, maybe also connect to tomorrow's talks, because tomorrow's talks are about thinking about projections, right? How do you sort of bring things together? What are some of our learnings? And of course, we're too close to what's happening right now. But I think there's very interesting ways in which many of you have started to, in some ways, allude to, some of the observations from what's going on, and also pointing to ways in which we're thinking, the trajectories that we're moving towards. But I think what was all interesting to kind of tie up all the three presentations was that all of you spoke of the form of the glossary, right? And I think that's the place that sort of also holds everything together. Malik spoke about this idea that the glossary is sort of made of these multiple stories, and that's what cities are made of. Cities are made of stories that are never fully shaped, right? And in shaping them, there's a politics in the shaping itself. And what is it that we do when we sort of start congealing some of these stories and putting them together? What is it that is put together, and what is it that is left out? So what does it mean to kind of have these stories together? And then he spoke about what the groove of the now is when you do not have maps, we don't have algorithms to think of the future. But I also kind of heard him in some ways speak about the fact, almost sort of alerting us that while there are these kind of ideas of mutual solidarities, there's also new forms of coercions that one has to sort of look out for. What does it mean to kind of have these coercions sitting right next to kind of networks of solidarities? And I think what was important is when he brought in the last sort of thinking of the form of the glossary through adjacencies. What does it mean to start actually in some ways, really sort of creating ways of connections? How do you sort of bring together, do the dogged work of making these new connections? But again, not new connections in just sort of going to Solly's ways of actually pointing out the problems of some of these connections, that when it may be in some ways another kind of cartography, which in some ways falls into the gaps. You may think that you're being progressive, but when your language is still the same, when your language is still sort of working with the ideas of cartographies and big data, you think you're progressive, but you're actually doing much more disservice to that fact, right? So then what do these adjacencies mean, and what are new ways of starting to look at connections that may not be replicating some of the older structures that in some ways we critique, right? So I think that was a very interesting sort of juxtaposition. And Mamta, I think, very beautifully brought in the idea that, I mean, in some ways also form, because it came from our own sort of practice of translation, right? What does it mean to sort of translate? What does it mean to kind of think of language that sort of moves fluidly from between ideas? And then how do you think of adjacencies through that, right? This kind of ideas that translation in some ways is not a mimic, but in some ways a kind of new expression that you bring about. So I think in that sense that the idea of adjacencies in translation, I think, has a lot to be explored in ways in which we kind of think of the world together. And also I think what was interesting in Mamta's case, again thinking of the form, she brought in a very interesting idea of how the glossary actually builds a sensibility, right? And what is this kind of sensibility that in some ways we need to build for ourselves? Because the glossary the pandemic in some ways has in some ways also collapsed our own sort of epistemic sort of ways of engaging with the world, right? So certain categories of knowledge that we understood, and we sort of created frameworks to kind of look at the world through, that seems to have collapsed. And so we need to build these new sensibilities, new ideas of sensoriums that come from probably poetry. And that's where Solly comes in again, connecting the two presentations very beautifully, where he talks of poetic spatiality. What does it mean? What is this new language that we need to deal with, right? Like the idea of poetic spatiality in some ways perhaps will start creating a new, in some ways an epistemic shift, because otherwise poetry seems to be, this kind of mild, this expression, which is in some ways, perhaps used for resistances and other things. But what does it mean to kind of think of the world through poetry, right? What does it mean to think of our sort of, mainstream existential ways of dealing with the world through poetry, really sort of transforming our own sort of entry point. So I think very, very beautiful. All the three presentations in some ways have, in some ways opened up for us ways of thinking of what the future trajectories might be. What is this new normal that we are getting into? What is this new world that we are sort of making? And I think this pandemic has been this kind of threshold for us to rethink the world from. So thank you so much for all three presentations. I'm going to ask the audience for questions. If there's anyone who is you would like to talk to the glossary, would like to talk to the respondents in some of the ideas that they've brought in. Anybody?
Hi. I mean, wonderful to listen to everyone. I'll just keep my video off for various reasons, and maybe follow Malik's provocation to keep things a little bit more mysterious. But I mean, it's fantastic to kind of hear everyone, Prasad, Momal, Vastavik, Rupali, Abdul Malik, Mamta, and Solomon. I'm just very briefly maybe add what I found to be like super interesting and something that I've been also thinking, particularly ever since the pandemic. 5 things that Abdul Malik brought in and 1 thing that Solomon brought in. One is, so let me just start with Malik's response. I think what Malik started by bringing out fantastically is the idea of opacity, right? In the sense that we would like to believe that we can construct narratives and give a linear logic, or maybe even a non-linear logic to the world. But I think there is something with what he calls as the holding back, or the withheldness of things itself, and that brings in a fantastic sense of opacity, which also has the capacity to surprise us in multiple ways, which is absolutely unpredictable. And pandemic has proven that capacity of things to be ever kind of how do I put this, like evading, if one can see that. And cities, particularly because of their intensities, and that's the next idea which I think Malik brought in very beautifully, is that it is in the now that we feel the intensity of things, right? And I want to open up the intensity in a little bit more, particularly last year when the pandemic started. One of the things that happened was literal shrinking of space to the household. And in that, one could feel the intensity literally, working as a kind of a pressure thing, like on you. But at the same time, another sense of intensity opened up, which is basically, I mean, in the same line, what it opened up is the idea of less space, right? The space itself started to shrink. The city is no longer the big thing, but it is your house. Everything is coming to your house, and you're not going anywhere. The things are coming towards you constantly. There was an incident where one of the deer fell through the roof in one of the slums in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, and that is like even like wild beasts are kind of literally falling through your roofs now in this pandemic. And in that sense, it's also interesting. Contrarily, there's also more space for other things now. While there is less space for us, there's more space for other things. Like there's more space for state to be stately. There is more space for for the environment to kind of be environment again. There is more space for all the activities that we're doing now at the moment, like so many Zoom calls and so many other engagements. I think that's another interesting thing that the idea of intensity brings in with it. And two more points. One is the idea of distance, again, following Abdul Malik's provocation. And this is also something that I've been thinking, that the question of distance is such crucial nowadays, because one of the important things, or the key things that urbanists relied on was on the capacity or the ability to look at things closely, right? Seeing things closely was the paramount, um, how do I say, the tool, the method to kind of uh, debunk established ways of looking at things, established networks or assumed networks of things, and so on and so forth. And today, that in the absence of that possibility, what this panel brings out very interestingly is how do you feel things more closely, you know? That became an interesting learning, I think, from here. And lastly, the idea of poetics and the question of translation. I think that what Solomon brought in the poetic entanglement, and what Abdul Malik brought in the idea of translations. I think the idea of translation in poetics is interesting because every act of translation, or in fact every connection that we make, every relationship that we want to build nowadays particularly, always requires and brings in the idea of mediation to establish that connection, and the effort that is required, whether it is the hilly landscape in Kerala that Solomon was mentioning about, or even the fact that just because two people are in the same room does not mean they're, you know, near or close, but you might feel closer to, let's say, at the loss of somebody who's like thousands of kilometers away from you, or the war that is taking place in another country in the times of pandemics. So yeah, I mean, these are fantastic learnings from me, and just wanted to add into all the wonderful contributions. Thanks.
Does anyone want to respond to what Shreyank has said?
Actually, I would like to say this whole notion of translation, I think during pandemic, otherwise also, I think it is one of the important perspectives of looking at world. And at least during pandemic, it's not just artists, but the simple, common people, like artists are not special, actually. Everybody has been translating, into different texts. They are creating their own texts, and they are putting it through. And the whole notion of trawling, for example, that happens. Okay, so it is also kind of seeing a context, or trying to translate a context in a different way and pushing it, promoting it. So whatever is happening now around us, I think it is important for us to have this lens of translation. Translation could be understood as what is getting translated into culture. That actually probably is the best definition for what translation is. I think it is one wonderful lens that would allow us to see this world in a different way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So Jibesh has a question for Solly. He says, Jibesh, do you want to come in?
Oh, you read the question.
So I'll read the question and maybe you want to add to it. So he says, how are materialities and densities of living connected to poetic spatiality, Solly? And Jibesh, do you want to add anything to that?
No, nothing. Just that, because I think the way Solly posed it, he posed it in opposition to certain kind of positivistic big data formations. So if you pose it in opposition, you have the burden to show that it is addressing the questions of materialities, density, certain historicity, certain kind of ways in which the nows are produced. So I think if we, because of this oppositional format of the where the big data becomes a threat to the, and the way Rupali also narrated it, I thought it, what does happen to the like years of idea of reading materialities, which escapes the poetic actually. And a lot of the time, my debate with artists and filmmakers have been this strength, and I think that's the tension in cinema, that's the tension in art. That materiality which escapes the poetic is what keeps it so tense and always asking new set of questions. So I was just curious. As I think even it would be interesting how Mamta or Abdul Malik could address this question if it gets posed as an oppositional practice.
I think one of the things about materialities is that I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right that the problem with this oppositional frame is that your response or the response tends to be like a mirror, and therefore just replicating the same like that's one of the issues with a lot of, say, activist kind of language. And I think in 2005 or so, where they came up in Bangalore, friends or people I know and friends, they came up with the Bangalore manifesto, which was actually for the new some master plan or something of that sort that was happening then in 2005. And it was almost exactly the same as what the FICCI, FICCI, that's the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce, they came up with their manifesto, at the national level, except they had, I think this one had something to, a vague kind of a item like housing rights or something, okay? And so there is definitely an issue about, the mirror problem. And I think the interesting Brazilian thinker and, part of the legal pluralism, Boaventura Santos, has an entire project on this called the Mirror Project, the mirror being the Alice in Wonderland type of a mirror. But coming back to materiality, I think one of the interesting things about what we are seeing around us is that people interpret different parts of the material world in different ways. And I think a lot of the, and therefore there's no fixity to it. The closest I can come to sort of thinking about this or giving an illustration is that there's an interesting sort of a frame in the dialogue with Kishan Khanna, the artist in the movie A Far Afternoon, where he talks about how they were taught about perspectives and framing in Paris, if I remember correct, where you got to put out your thumb and then you measure a particular item, and that's how we were taught perspective when we were doing architecture, so that you replicate exactly what you're measuring out in a very deeply cartographic way. And then of course the ideal kind of proportion, the golden rule and all. And he makes a point that when he's talking about painting in Jangpura Extension or Bhogal and a street scene there, he said it's not your brain pushing your brush, but it's your mind and experiencing that space. And sort of having lived there in Bhogal, Jangpura Extension, as you also do, the experience of that place as a street gets deeply embedded, and it's highly material. I mean, for me, it's also one big black bull that decided to chase me while I was trying to do a photography of it chasing someone else, and I knew that bull because I used to see that every day. And then suddenly it decided to wake up and, so, I mean, the point is that I think the way people and I think that's the point that Kishan Khanna is making, is to break out of that mirror-like cartography. And I just thought about the poetic part, because I thought in the previous two presentations and the COVID glossaries, what really was empowering them was this kind of possibility. I mean, I'm learning a lot from a colleague of mine and friend, Shilata, who's a poet, and I'm always struck by how free the framing is, unlike what, in sort of social sciencey terms we get locked into. So I think there's a sort of escape that is constantly possible, which in a lot of other frames it's not. I don't know that fully. And I think the mirror problem is probably less in this space than other spaces. I don't know if that fully addresses your question. But yeah, thank you.
Malik and Mamta, do you want to?
Yeah. I think I want to respond. First of all, I would not want to give a special pedestal for this poetic speciality. Otherwise, it can be used as a parallel kind of a tool which could, because, the conventional kind of approach is not accessible to everyone. It doesn't mean that this poetic speciality is also accessible to everyone. It is not. It's the worst. Because, always the thing is like mostly, people who are artists, poets, let me talk about, this doesn't apply to everyone. They think that they can speak everything in the world, history, political science, everything, with no proper historical, everybody don't. But it's important for the poetic speciality to happen with a proper historical, socio-political awareness. Only then it makes sense, and it can challenge the conventional kind of like cartography or whatever, the conventional kind of looking at spaces or cities or whatever, and it will also probably ease your visual language. It gives you more strength to visualize, to speak, to probably hold the pulse of whatever you are doing, only if that is backed with a proper preparation of historical, socio-political understanding. Otherwise, it is yet another fake possibility, like exactly the conventional one. This is what I would want to say.
Malik, do you want to come in?
I mean, I think the relationship of the materiality to the poetics oftentimes is like the notion that Bernard Stiegler invoked of the pharmacon. It's sort of indeterminate at any particular moment whether or not something is going to work or not work. Give you an example. I mean, under what circumstances does this particular materialization of an apartment in East London represent viable or suitable or appropriate housing for a family from Bangladesh, for example, in Newham, in East Ham, in the large swathes of South Asian dominated neighborhoods of East London. How are certain imaginaries materialized that in some ways deems particular kinds of material spaces suitable for an understanding of the conventional Bangla family, and of course the materialization isn't in any way consonant with who actually inhabits those spaces and in what ways. And therefore, with high density occupied apartments, in some ways compensated by elaborating particular kinds of arrangements that take place amongst otherwise distinct households. So you have these arrangements of circulation that are continuously rearranged, where kitchens and sleeping spaces and living spaces are always, in some sense, articulated in different kinds of ways to create a sense of spaciousness and that spaciousness is what is inhabited, and the individual flats and apartments become elements of this continuous recomposition. And in some ways, during the pandemic, these kinds of circulations, this kind of materialization of inhabitation and the way in which it was continuously recomposed became both the problem and the compensation for the problem. And it sometimes it was difficult to determine which is which. I mean, it can go either way, depending on how you frame things and frame both in the sense of how you understand it and frame in terms of framing someone, setting them up to be framed, to be the responsible, to be the victim, to be that which is, responsible for their own, for example, large incidence rates of infection. So in some ways, the relationship of the materialization and the poetics is always hovers in a kind of indeterminate relationship. Both are constantly operating on each other, but in ways that are not always univocally clear. Yeah, that's just some quick.
Prasad, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just I mean, not in opposition, in the sense that it, like, I understand what Jibesh is saying, that the moment you pose the poetic in opposition with big data, and then that is where the problem starts, because like poetics cannot be without material also, and vice versa, kind of. So, like for example, when the practice of making like the Padmanabhapuram Palace, when it was made, like complex construction system, but when it is made, the codes are given as poetic form, but that poetic form is a language, which is kind of, which is part of the practice, and it is kind of so you have carpenters who are getting measurements in singing those poetic forms, but because it is not coming in as poetry, as a pedestalized idea of poetry, but it is a kind of practice which kind of comes in. Now, what happens with like for example, if I would say that the non-poetic realm of, say, cartography, for example, like cartography sets up and shapes the ideas of how we kind of put together an understanding of property, privacy, permanence, transactability, living, etc. Now, the thing is that because cartography became the instrument which can be easily hijacked, but also kind of, it became the instrument of power, and it became a good revenue collector's device. So it is the I wouldn't say mean it in oppositional terms, but in mobilization terms. You mobilize, say, big data when you need them. It's kind of it's as poetic as anything else. You mobilize cartography when you need them. You mobilize poem when you need them, if you kind of want to slip. The thing is how you want to slip and pose. I think that's where the problem, the intention is actually.
Yeah, I think that's where also Solly's example of not being opposed to the state, but kind of starting to look at the messiness that sort of is engaged as well, the idea of entanglements, that it's their networks, and the idea of excessive centralization perhaps doesn't work, but there are other ways in which it's sort of solidarity networks kind of work also, and not sort of in spite of the state. So in that sense, this idea of fuzziness of sort of relationships is something that Solly also brought out. But in that sense, I also wanted to kind of ask Mamta that you said that poetry shouldn't kind of be, poetic speciality shouldn't be put on a pedestal, and sometimes it could be dangerous, or without a full poetic, without a full sort of awareness of the socio-political. But I'm just kind of also asking if there is a way of entering, without this kind of kind of the knowledge of a larger sort of structure, but is there a possibility of the poetic, in some ways also being political, without kind of fully knowing, the larger project? So I'm just kind of asking you, in terms of practice, in terms of, where you enter from.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to think that I am not a carpenter, because I don't know how to make a table or a chair which can stand by its own. But I can write poems. Therefore, I'm somebody who cannot be a carpenter. Okay, I'm writing poems. I have words at schools. I'm doing this. The first thing is that. The second thing is, and again, there are so many words, so much of visual, so many metaphors, everything. How do you deal with it? Okay, one is without any, you need not know anything. That state doesn't occur for me, because you live in something. You live in a time, given socio-political space. You live, you breathe, you suffer, you enjoy. Therefore, whether you know history or not, whatever, but you know the time in which you live and what the time is doing to you. So you can write. But when will something become a poem? See, I always ask, maybe whatever I am saying might not, there are different possibilities of making a poem. But for me, poem happens when you edit it. Usually, you write a lot, right? You can write. See, one is, why are some poems remembered? Why are not everything remembered? Okay. Some things can be remembered because poetry also has two other dimensions, not just the meaning. Meaning comes later. It has the sound design, sound pattern, okay? And the visuals that you create. The sound, visual, word, everything to be layered and constructed and made and chiseled, and then it becomes a poem. And it's so difficult to answer your question, but I feel, because people say that, okay, always men have been writing love poems and women have been even today, youngsters, they just write around women. See, though things have changed, they don't realize. Look at the cinema songs. They never improve. Okay. Still circling around something, or something is happening. So the popular culture will let you know that things haven't changed. Because, as a writer, as a poet, when you write something, you are writing in a time. So it is important to open your eyes and ears. I really don't know, Rupali, whether I'm answering your question or not, but it's so difficult to make a poem. So that is why I'm saying that, if you are backed up with a proper socio-political, historical context, and if you know, then again, there is no proper historical. History has been written, rewritten, and, walked backwards, which is happening right now. So therefore, that's why I'm saying poets are not special. Artists are not special. They can't do the carpentry, they are doing poetry. I really don't know how to answer your question, but People can write. Because people write without the knowledge of history or socio-political circumstances. They do write. Why do they write? Because they live in that history and that socio-political circumstance. We write about bodies, we write about sexuality, we write about all kinds of things come in. Why does that come in? Because we live in it. And therefore, there is some knowledge of it. It happens. I don't know, Rupali.
Malik, do you want to come in? Malik is also kind of responding here.
No, just to amplify, something that struck me about the COVID glossary exhibition is that when you have this page, and then you attempt to enter into trying to find out what things are, you have to follow your mouse to around these things that are in some sense circling each other. They're in motion, and then you have to sort of synchronize your touch with this kind of motion. And just to say that, yeah, I mean, those larger structures are a kind of summation. It's a kind of abstract summation of a process of things always in this kind of process of being rearranged. So if you take the household, I mean, and our affective, the intensity of our affective relationship with that notion of household. Well, that affective intensity, of course, is partly needed in order to sustain the integrity and the endurance of that household. But think of all the multiple kind of work, of recalibration, of repositioning, of rearrangements that household participates in on a daily basis in order to sustain the sense of itself as a kind of enduring object in time. So the multiplicity of things that are being rearranged, recalibrated, always in motion, in order for any sense of endurance and obdurance to be able to attain from this. So I think all I'm trying to say is that the process of trying to navigate the atmosphere of the glossary is a kind of technique. It's a techniques of rehearsing those kinds of incessant rearrangements that are taking place in everyday urban life all the time, in order for any single position and its endurance to be maintained.
Yeah, I think that was I think that was an important thing for the glossary itself, that it was almost impossible to sort of, position yourself in one way or the other to kind of, create a kind of larger structure to kind of work with, because moment you sort of started looking at building that structure and sort of seeing it close, you saw it already disintegrating. And I think that's where my question to Mamta also came from. But I understand I understand this, the analogy that you come from your own practice as well. But I think that was something important for us, because what does it mean to kind of, are our older structures sufficient to kind of, even position what we understand as a kind of a socio-economic political awareness, or are there ways in which, those themselves are in some ways getting restructured from, from these multiple stories that are, as in Malik's words, perhaps not fully formed yet, right? And in that act of, not being fully formed, there's so many holes and so many experiences that in some ways also poke holes in some of the larger structures that we have held so close to us as as activists, as kind of people engaged in really sort of thinking of the world through. And so I think that kind of rearrangement that Malik is talking about is something that is happening with, with the form of the glossary. And I'm just kind of, this is the question, whether that's the kind of, whether that's the role of the poetic, to be able to, restructure known ways of looking at things, and sort of, come back and almost sort of question our own sort of positionalities, and probably shake a little bit of the ground below us, to be able to, to be able to rethink our world anew. So I think that was where my question came from, Mamta, and yeah, thanks Malik for this intervention as well. Does anyone else have any questions? We have another maybe 5-10 minutes to go.
Sabi has written something.
Sabi has written. Oh, sorry. Sabi, do you want to come in, please? Sabi's here. Sabi, you can speak. I think it's much nicer.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sabi.
Hello. It's I'll just read out what I read, that the presentations today and also the glossary itself proposes the new parameters to read and participate in what both Prasad and Rupali and everyone talked about, a reconfiguration of spaces and temporalities. And in a way, it felt like we're talking about counter methodologies of producing and making legible spaces against the technocratic and cartographic techniques. Yeah. So do you think the methodologies and techniques we're rethinking after the emergence of the pandemic will also make us reread the way spatiality and life were read historically in the past, or say maybe in the 20th century? Or does this become a discourse of a before and after pandemic reading? Because in my view, it's much more than being a discourse that's emerging after the pandemic. These kind of methodologies is what we were seeing with Sarai readers also, with so many other kinds of initiatives, which made us rethink the forms of life and practice that produce cities and publicness. So the question is really about how one can also think about not making this a before and after, and if anyone has any views on that.
Solly, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, hi, thank you for this question, Savib. I think one of the points is that in this kind of working this kind of spatiality, in a sense, it is accumulative in some sense. I think, and that is so even this before and after, I think there's definitely been a kind of a change in the way people are connecting up together. And but I think there's a kind of a persistence of that. To go back to the discussion between Rupali and Mamta about the issue that do you need or that you need a kind of a overarching sense of a kind of a political history. And her clarification, as I understood it, is that, people are experiencing it on a kind of now basis. And that's, in a sense, the most powerful way of, which is a highly material way. And I think it's those that's why I felt this word entanglements and indeterminacy is really important. You don't know how things are going to work out, but you're kind of trying out various connections. And there is definitely a memory of that. I think the other thing that has definitely come up is that a lot of the kind of cartographic seduction that was happening, whether it is medical science. Now there's this whole thing about, is the virus actually coming out of a lab or not? And, constantly there's a kind of a questioning of a lot of established kind of rationals, which I think maybe even a year and a half ago, people would be sort of believers in one or the other. And so I think there's a kind of thing that is going to a kind of a sense of space that is going to persist. I mean, one thing that comes out again from the glossaries is the sense of stories. And this is just coincidence, but when I was returning to Boventera Santos's, towards the Southern epistemology of one of his writings, I mean, he kind of made this point that once you have these stories, and it links to Prasad's point about a sense of capture, a lot of social sciencey kind of stuff is now directly feeding in a kind of a capture. I mean, unless you are part of that project, you don't get funding. You have to write it in your proposal. And then, I mean, someone can actually research this, but because a lot of the proposals are online, made to various foundations, it's amazing what a group of people who are supposedly, progressive and all, are writing up to sell their research to get the funding. But they might, I mean, it might be okay, it's a kind of a gaming kind of a thing. But if you look closely at the categories, it's not very different from how it could slip into that capture. So, yeah, so I think the persistence, I think that's, as Mamta was saying, the people live in a particular time and they're experiencing it in a very hard way. And that's of huge political learning. And I don't think that disappears so soon, So I think Prasad has a point.
No, just I mean, like bringing in Dibesh's point also, I kind of, the pandemic is too big to not hold a discussion around it. Actually, it's like it exists now, and it is now, it is there now. Now, what do you do? Because the telescopes and microscopes are not working. When I say telescopes and microscopes, I mean the instruments that were used to on a deterministic platform, the deterministic sciences, and that's why the glossary, because the glossary kind of seeks to accumulate stories from the world, as many as possible. Only thing is we're not kind of putting questionnaires and language barriers, and so it becomes kind of it becomes a kind of a thick, voluminous reconstruction of the life. So in that sense, it's, I mean, at one level, yes, I mean, it is kind of taking a position with respect to the technocratic, the cartographic, etc., etc., etc. But you live through the pandemic and you realize that cartographies are unable to handle the complexity in its complete form. They have their ways, they have the numbers are coming in, they are kind of saying things, and they are kind of but those questionnaires, telescopes, microscopes are unable to handle many other things which are going on, and I think those things is where humanity gets located. Solidarities, friendships, small compassions, small ideas, everyday practices, so many things. So I think that's where the whole, and if it appears, standing against cartography and technography, yeah, I mean, maybe also, like, I'm not putting it in opposition. Sorry, Rishabh Chadjar has a question.
Yeah. Just Rishabh.
I would like to respond to this. I would just want to say that when you see the glossary, the stories in the glossary, I would like to, Sabi, I would like to take your last sentence and begin with my response. How do we prevent this discourse from being before and after pandemic readings? Okay. So when you look at the glossary and see the stories associated in the glossary, you definitely know that that it is not just the momentous now story. You know, the story has a story behind it. You know, I think again I would like to say that, you know, it's, as you said, it's very important for us not to put this barrier of before and after. There is no before and after. Present has a baggage. It has a story. Every story has its own past or the present. You know, I think it has led to this. I think we need to remember that bit. And I think then, you know, like, it's very important for us not to put a barrier of before and after pandemic. For the glossary stories, all of them, you know, it will remind you of so many things when you approach it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I also, to kind of add to what I think Mamta also said that in her presentation as well, right? That there are many backstories to the pandemic, and but I think what is important is that you know, pandemic in some ways amplified, you know, some of the fissures that already existed. I mean, for us, we saw that very, very clearly. We were always speaking of, for example, you know, the fissures in the university, this big kind of white elephant of the university. But it kind of really sort of amplified in the pandemic. You saw that kind of complete collapse, right? And then, so from here, is there a kind of going back to that kind of, you know, big elephant, or is there another sort of rearrangement, restructuring? And we're seeing that happen. It's not possible for it to go back to that old sort of, you know, unagile kind of structure. So yes, it's not just the pandemic. It has backstories, as Mamta is saying. It has, you know, it's also kind of you know, some of the fissures existed before, but they're amplified, and in some ways we're now at a threshold where we are perhaps not going to be able to go back. And so we really have to start thinking of what it is that it's now leading to, and that kind of thinking might really help us to prepare ourselves for those next steps. So yeah, thanks, Abhi. Prasad, you want to say something, and then we'll have Rishabh Chadar come in.
No, I'm saying Rishabh has a question.
Yes, Rishabh, please. Rishabh,
yeah. So I have a actually this question, you know, came a while back, and now after listening to a lot of deliberations, I am kind of finding it really difficult to locate myself. You know, and I have a lot of locations in my question also, so I'll just speak it anyway. So then when we look back at the glossary anytime after this pandemic is over, it will help us, you know, locating that humanity, the friendships, the networks that we have around. But you know, I would like to go back to the poetic spatiality, and then how do I locate poetic spatiality sociopolitically or in opposition to materiality or cartography? I know our discussions have already been around it, but I'm still trying to do it. And you know, are we looking at it essentially as a framework to think, or a good story can also be considered within this framework? No, I did Animal Farm a couple of days back again, and it helped me to locate myself in this context. You know, I could draw parallels between our state now and I mean, yeah, I have a lot of ambiguity around this. What to, yeah, how do I, you know, essentially locate myself, and then look at the glossary or understand the questions, and you know, what is it trying to do? Yeah.
Thanks, Rishabh. I mean, I must say Rishabh is also a poet. Studies at sea. So the question of location is interesting because the conceptual location, like how you kind of uh, uh, and that horizon that you sketched for yourself in the beginning ke bhai 20 saal ke baad jab after 20 years when hopefully things will be different, then how do you look at this work? What does this work kind of mean and say and stuff like that? I think that like whether you see yourself as a contributor, as an optic outside, whether you see it as where do you kind of come in as to how do you engage with everything using the glossary, all of those questions. I think at the moment the glossary for us is a space to share stories. Now at the moment I would think to leave it at that, to kind of share stories and kind of let the pandemic go through the many waves that it is coming through. It's kind of it will if we Mumal and Vastu have started building constellations to kind of make sense, and then I can and what happened was interesting because they started with 20 and then they moved into 40 and then now they have 74 of them, because it doesn't end, because constellations are creating and it is kind of complicating it more and more. So these stories, these micro narratives, they have within themselves, because we've not applied any filter to the way people have kind of written, and they have that generative, spiraling energy actually. And when they spiral and so many others also spiral together, they kind of they're creating their own intensities. So I don't know about the location question, which is basically how does it become instrumental, where, when, how, etc. But I would at the moment be with the glossary for some more time, maybe 6-8 months more, to kind of see what do the stories kind of work themselves out into and stuff like that. So we'll spend more time on this, Rishabh. We'll kind of work this out. Yeah.
Can I say something to this?
Yes.
Rishabh, I think for me, when you were asking the question, I was also simultaneously thinking what you are asking. Location is, we are located in our languages, because language is highly political. Language again is a tool. Language need not be just Marathi or Kannada or English or Hindi. Language is beyond that. Language is something that makes meaning, makes stereotypes, breaks stereotypes. So once we locate in whatever language we choose, then, because all those narratives that are there in the glossary are located in different issues through languages. Issues of the way you address, the way you say, tell a story, the way you showcase a story, the way you live a story, the way you lose a story. I think all these experiences are being put there. So locations can be multiple. So a story within the glossary has multiple locations. Location within the storyteller, within the collector, within somebody who is putting it in such a particular way, and within us who are reading it from our locations. Me from Bengaluru in my Kannada locations, from my experiences, whatever, as a woman, I am approaching that. Therefore, location is something that is a very important thing, and we need to, there is no one location. There are multiple locations, like multiple identities. If we start thinking about it through language, maybe to some extent, I think, whatever stories are there in the glossary are also living elsewhere at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful kind of thing to end it with. And I think Rishabh's question was, in some ways, also very important question to sort of end this session with, the question of what the glossary is. Is it a framework to think? Is it experiential? And I think that's what, in being sort of, deeply experiential and bringing in the multiplicity of experiences of living through the pandemic, it's also in some ways a framework to think. And the way we start looking at the connections, as Malik mentioned, and drawing those kind of unpossible connections, I think in that framework of thinking is only going to get richer. So I think it's only a project that we've just begun, and that's why we have a lot of our respondents to help us, everybody else here to kind of think together with us, what this kind of framework of thinking the future could be. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. It's been a wonderful 3 productive hours, and please join us tomorrow again at 5:30 IST for the continued session tomorrow with 3 other very, very interesting respondents. So thanks, and see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Mamta. Malik had to leave, but yeah.
Ollie tomorrow.
Bye, Jibesh.
See you, bye.